Hey everyone, and welcome to our November live event with National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki here to answer all of your sewing questions. Thank you so much for being here, Nicki.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right. So if this is your first time tuning in to one of these events, what's going to happen is for the next hour, Nicki is going to answer as many sewing questions as she can, either ones that were pre-submitted or ones that are submitted live. So to ask your question, you can type it into the comment box below the video, and we'll work our way through those. We're also available all the time to answer questions on our website, as well as all of the most popular social media like Facebook and Twitter. All right, we're going to start off with a question here from Debbie. And she says, how do you use the rolled hem foot, especially on square or rectangular projects? Starting and stopping are not neat.
Yes, so when doing a rolled hem, using the rolled hem foot, oftentimes starting the first couple of stitches is the hardest part. So the rolled hem foot, in case anyone is not familiar, looks like this. It comes in varying widths, but it's got this little kind of seashell funnel inside to roll the fabric and double fold the fabric as it goes under the foot to create a nice double fold hem easily. Oftentimes you're using this foot with a lightweight fabric. So to get that started, you'll want to, or oftentimes the best way to start out is to cut a strip of stabilizer just a skosh narrower than the width of the hem, and fuse that skosh narrower and then 1 to 2 inches long, so very, very small. Fuse that to the raw edge right at the beginning of your hem edge, and then fold the fabric over right along the edge of that interfacing. Give it a press, fold it over again, press again so you get your double fold with the stabilizer in there, and put it under your foot with the rolled hem foot on your machine. And if you're using a really lightweight fabric, it may behoove you to use a little bit of tissue paper here to put under the fabric, so that that just prevents the fabric from getting shoved down into the throat plate when you're starting your stitching line. And when you're starting out, leave long thread tails at the back. Can kind of pull them a little bit as you're starting out. That also helps your fabric to not get shoved down into the throat plate as well. So line your fabric up under the presser foot with the final fold of the hem aligned with this toe of your foot. And start stitching just right before you even try to get the fabric folded around the little funnel inside the foot. Just stitch a couple of stitches just to get it started, to get that fabric kind of, get the hem tacked down and get it started and stable. So stitch an inch or so of stitches just to get it started, and then stop, lift the presser foot, and then either using your fingers or a pair of tweezers, get that fabric, the fabric folds wrapped around this little funnel. And then you can go on stitching, and the fabric will sort of feed into that little funnel and it'll fold itself, and you'll get a really nice, even, narrow, double folded hem, or a rolled hem as it's called with the feet. And go slowly, stop every couple of inches, lift the presser foot and make sure your fabric is double folding and it's the width that you want it to be. And when you are doing a project that is a square or rectangular project like a scarf, you have a silk rectangle, you want to hem the edges and make a scarf. I'm not sure if there's another way to do it where you get, nice like mitered edges or anything. But when you're using you want to use the rolled hem foot for your edges, you may just have to do each edge separately. Just do one edge at a time. And when you're doing that, you run into the problem where the finished edge of, one edge of your square that finished hem, even if you're using a really lightweight fabric, it gets too thick at that double folded edge to go through this little narrow funnel. So you'll have to, I would recommend starting each edge. Start the edge where you don't have that double folded finished edge, where you can. So you've got your square. When you do your last edge, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have finished edge on both sides. But wherever possible, start with a nice raw edge so that you can interface your edge and get that nice, crisp, double folded edge started. And then when you sew down, so you start at your raw edge and you sew down and you've got your already double folded finished edge over here, just stop right before that. Take your fabric out from under the presser foot, out from under your rolled hem foot. Leave long thread tails so you can pull the thread to the wrong side and tie it off so you don't have to back stitch on your silk fabric. And just put on your regular presser foot to double fold that and just finish off that last tiny little bit just using a regular foot. And if you have a stiletto, that's really helpful in making sure that that narrow double fold, that narrow rolled hem finish stays nice under the presser foot as you're sewing it. So a stiletto is really useful there. But otherwise, the bulk of that rolled hem that's already stitched a lot of times will not fit through these narrow little funnels. So on your last edge of your rectangular project, where you've got all 3 edges hemmed and finished, you'll just have to kind of do the same thing. Since it's not really going to fit into your funnel, just start right below it, or start by double fold, press it, double fold it by hand, stitch over that that little bit of a starting point with your regular presser foot, using tissue paper underneath and pulling the thread tails to get it started, and then hop over to your rolled hem foot so that you don't have that bulk trying to shove through the funnel. So hopefully that somewhere in there will have helpful tips.
I definitely think so.
I definitely think so. Yeah.
I think it's definitely a hard foot to get started with. Have you ever started by sewing on a different piece of fabric first and then maybe fed into it? If you didn't want to have, I mean, if you're using a super lightweight fabric that you didn't want to interface or couldn't press or something like that.
Right, or if it's transparent or something, right, that you don't want to interface. I have never tried it like that, but yeah, using a starter scrap of fabric would be something that you could probably try, because you use a starter scrap of fabric when you want to start a seam that you don't want to start the seam right on the project fabric, so that could definitely be helpful as well.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Beverly, and she says, sewing on jersey knit is giving me fits. Any tips?
Yes, Beverly, you're in good company there. Jersey knit is pretty tricky to stitch on. That really slinky, stretchy fabric that feels so good when you're wearing it. That t-shirt that you make is going to be fantastic to wear, but sewing it is pretty tough. First of all, whenever you're sewing any knit, especially a jersey knit, make sure you have a ballpoint needle on your machine. Ballpoint, or sometimes it's called a stretch needle or even a jersey needle. All 3 of those names, I use those needles interchangeably. They're all the same sort of constructed needle, made specifically for knits. Make sure you're using a thread that is not a cotton thread. So a 100% cotton thread does not have any give or any stretch to it at all. And if you stretch your seams, it's going to break. So use an all-purpose thread or a polyester thread. And an all-purpose thread is just a cotton-wrapped polyester core thread. So it's got that, the polyester has a little more give to it. So, but it's going to give and it's going to mesh better with your knit fabrics. When you're sewing knit fabric, a walking foot can be very useful, or something like that, like a roller foot, something that helps feed the upper layer of fabric through under your presser foot, because underneath, you know, on the bed of your machine, on the underneath layer of fabric, you've got your feed dogs pulling the fabric. And especially with a shifty, stretchy, slinky jersey knit fabric, a lot of times the lower layer of fabric and the upper layer of fabric are not going to feed evenly through under the presser foot unless you have another mechanism working on the upper layer of fabric to pull it through at an even rate as the lower layer of fabric. So a roller foot or a walking foot, which is like one of these crazy things, which lifts up and, like, I wish I could have it on my machine to show, but you know.
It's like an alligator is like grabbing it and going. Yeah.
Exactly. Just like the feed dogs on the underneath, it kind of bites the fabric and pulls it along to help feed it evenly. Oh, and here's my roller foot is in there somewhere, but
I feel like you showed us this beautiful box of feet at one time, didn't you? Like perfectly organized or something. What happened to that?
I moved and the box took up too much space. So the box, it was a big box, and this takes up way less space. So
I feel like that's pretty much what everybody ends up with, is a bag of feet. So
yeah, had to condense, but so yeah, super organized. But roller foot is in there somewhere, but that's just got like a little steamroller on the foot to help pull the fabric under the foot. So your presser foot can help. There's also a foot called the knit foot, I believe, which is just a very narrow foot. So the smaller area the presser foot is smashing down on the fabric, the less pressure is going to be put on the layers of fabric, and especially the upper layer of fabric. So in theory, that feeds everything through more evenly, and you don't get, you know, the stretching of the fabric, and you don't get the shifting of the fabric. So that can also be helpful. I've never used one, but I've read about it. So if you happen to have one, give that a try.
Never even heard of it. I'm gonna have to look it up. For like the second time in my life that I'll ever sew with knit fabric, but I'll have it for when I try.
It'll make your life a lot easier when you do the next time you try that.
Okay.
A lot of times also when you are sewing knit fabric, you're trying to do the hem or something, you'll get a ripple in your seam. It'll, you know, do that wavy, puckery thing. A lot of times you can steam that out afterward, but if you can, try to prevent that from happening in the first place, prevent that stretching of the fabric. Using a presser foot that will help feed the upper layer of fabric along with the lower layer of fabric will help relieve that puckering. You can also try and layer tissue paper under the knit fabric. That will help stabilize the knit and keep it from stretching out. Let's see, what else? Those two things are really good problem solvers with knit fabric. And if you have any specific issues with sewing knit fabric, definitely send them in. But hopefully those will cover quite a lot of issues.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, this might be a lot of the same similar responses, but Jenny wants to know, how do you sew spandex fabric? And I guess, and along with that, how is, say, spandex different from jersey knit?
Yes, spandex. So spandex is a knit that is, the fiber is blended with a stretch fiber. So the actual fibers are stretched, I believe. It's like a, you know, an elastic. Yeah. Yeah, something like that. So all of the same things apply when you're sewing with spandex. It is still a knit constructed fabric. It's a lot of times thinner and finer than even your jersey knit fabric. So you may want to use, in that case, a thinner thread. So if you can find a lightweight thread or a fine thread that is still a polyester fiber content thread, that can be helpful. So using a thinner thread, using a lighter weight needle. So make sure you're still using your ballpoint, your jersey, or your stretch labeled needle, but using a thinner variety. So the needle sizes, the larger the number, the larger the needle. So it directly corresponds. So going down to a 60 size needle, or if it's thinner than that, I don't know, but in the multi-packs, I think they go down. They give you like an 80, some 70, and a 60. So that you may even be able to purchase thinner than that, but I've never had to use anything smaller than a size 65 or 60 needle. So smaller needle size can be helpful with spandex, and indeed with any fabrics that are lighter weight and thinner and finer, and you don't want snags in, like chiffons and things like that. So thinner needle, thinner thread. The layers of spandex, when you put them together to sew, you may get shifting, a lot of shifting there. Some spandex that I have bought has like a sheen on the outside, so it is very, very slippery, some varieties. So to cut down on the shifting between the layers, throw a layer of tissue paper in between. Ashley,
I know,
this is the third.
We're at the third reference. I have to say, I think you are so excited that the holidays are here because I think tissue paper's on sale. Like, I think you're just going to stock up and just put it all in your sewing room.
I'm just going to, like, everybody gives gift bags with all that tissue paper, and I'm just going to, like, throw away the gift and keep the tissue paper.
I'm going to save all mine for you this year.
Thank you. I will use it. Use it all the time.
I know.
So putting a layer of tissue paper between the layers of fabric, just cut down on the area of slippery fabric that touches each other. So just giving those layers of fabric something to grab onto that's not, the slippery surface of each other helps cut down on shifting. So that's another thing you can try if your spandex is getting all crazy and shifty. And sewing any sort of knit fabric, jersey knit, spandex, whenever you're sewing a seam that has to stretch, so like a neckline seam or a seam that goes around your body that you're gonna have to stretch to like get over your head or wear around your hips or something, you need to sew with a stretch stitch. So a zigzag stitch or a triple stitch, or I think my FOF even has like a special zigzag stitch that has an extra zig in it, or maybe an extra zag, I'm not sure, but it's extra zigzaggy to give extra stretch, so that the seam will stretch with the fabric. If you sew a straight seam around and you try to stretch it, obviously it's going to break. So make sure you use a stitch that will stretch with your seam.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, this is going to be a little bit more broad, kind of bridging into quilting, but still can be helpful to anybody trying to cut out different strips or pieces. But any suggestions, please, when cutting out strips, squares, etc. for quilting? I measure so carefully, but somehow I'm always off after cutting or using a rotary cutter.
Yes, so when cutting strips or squares,
like if you were going to cut out a long strip for even like bias tape or something, or like how do you make sure it's 2.5 inches all the way across? Like how do you fit that on your, your mat or whatever?
If I'm trying to cut, if I need to cut a long strip, if my strip only needs to be kind of short, I'll just, try to measure carefully, and then make sure that when you're cutting, your cutting mat is on a hard surface. To put my cutting mat on my bed before, and that's a huge pain because it dips and it shifts and you're not going to get a straight cut along the edge of your ruler. So make sure you're cutting on a hard surface underneath your mat. Also, you want to press down on your ruler when you're cutting, but not too hard, because if you press down too hard on your ruler, it's easier for it to slip, actually, when you're putting a lot of pressure on it. So you want to put pressure to make sure the ruler stays, but not too much. So it's a fine line. But also, I love to talk about when you're cutting out a lot of bias strips, the method of cutting yourself a square and then cutting it diagonally. And it's called the continuous bias binding method. So you can type that into your search bar if you're interested.
Didn't you do a video on that for us?
I did. It's a section of a video, of a longer video, I believe. I don't think it's a short one. I don't think. But it's, I think it was in my intermediate sewing tips video, and it was in the section of mitering and binding.
Gotcha.
The continuous bias binding section. So it's there on National Sewing Circle. It's a couple of hours of me talking about intermediate sewing tips. So you get a lot in there if you're interested in seeing me demonstrate that continuous bias binding method. You can also type it into your search bar, and there's lots of tutorials with pictures and YouTube videos you can find. But basically, there's a mathematical formula for you to find out how much binding or how big the square needs to be for how much binding length you need, and factoring in the width of your binding and everything. But you cut a square according to whatever width you need, cut it diagonally, you sew the edges together, mark your lines for the width of your binding, and then you sew the edge in an offset loop, and then cut it apart, and it becomes this big long string of continuous bias binding. Mm-hmm. So that's a nifty way to get your binding, and it comes out nice and even. Usually, if you've got to do your marking right, but it's less emphasis put on the evenness of your cuts and more on just drawing your lines, which is a lot of times easier to get nice even lines than it is to cut with a rotary cutter. So
absolutely.
So there's that as well.
Yes. And since Mary asked this question, if you are interested in specifically more quilting related material, we do have a sister site, nationalquilterscircle.com, full of tons of videos on how to cut and measure, and even videos on how exactly much pressure to put on that ruler, and this little technique where you put your pinky finger on the outside to hold it from slipping. So all sorts of fun videos over there too. So definitely check that out. That's National Quilter Circle. All right, our next question here, this is from Jenny, and I believe I'm understanding this correctly, but if not, please do correct me. But she wants to know why the thread becomes loose after her son plays with a garment if she sews a button on using her machine, say versus by a hand. Like, how does it, say, knot off and make sure it's nice and secure on a machine?
Right, so when you sew the button using the machine, yes. So when you sew a button on using your machine, you disengage the feed dogs and you use your zigzag stitch to sew in the holes of the button. And when you can try to use your back stitch function then to lock it, but I don't know if it works the same when your feed dogs are disengaged and your fabric's not actually moving. I don't know if it locks the same. So I always leave thread tails and I pull the thread to the wrong side and I tie it off. I double knot just to make sure you get it nice and locked tightly, because buttons, it's a stress point on garments. You want to make sure they stay nice, locked tight. And if you want an extra added measure of protection, you can take a little bit of fray check or another type of fabric glue and dab a little bit on the wrong side of the thread or even on the right side of the thread, just on top of the button, to make sure those threads stay locked.
Yep, absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Jackie, and she says, how would you sew a lace applique onto sheer fabric with a sewing machine instead of hand stitching?
You would want to use a very fine thread, matching the applique as much as you can. And if the applique has like a, denser stitching around the edges of it, try to follow along that so you're not stitching right, along the sheer part of the lace applique. So try to follow the header of the lace as much as you can. Use a fine, like I said, a fine thread and a fine point needle, a smaller size needle, making sure that you don't get any snags in your nice sheer fabric. Yeah, those are generally the tips that I would use if I was doing that.
Do you have to stabilize it at all, do you think? I mean, with maybe tissue paper, but I mean, because they are both lightweight, open.
Right, yeah, a lace onto a sheer lightweight fabric, you would probably want to stabilize that. You could use tissue paper. You could also use, if you have any tearaway stabilizer, something like that, or a water-soluble stabilizer, which is oftentimes used for machine embroidery. But it can be super helpful in cases like this, where you want a little extra support for your stitches and to make sure your fabric doesn't get stretched out of whack when you're trying to move it under the machine. And then when you want that stabilizer to go away, a tearaway in this instance might be even put too much pressure on the stitches when you're trying to tear it away. So water soluble, which is why I mentioned that, is very, very gentle on the stitches and on the fabric afterward, because you can cut away most of it or tear away most of it, because the water soluble is thinner, so tearing it away is easier. And then just dab a little water on the rest along the line to make it disappear. But yeah, that's a good call. You may want to stabilize something like that. That is so fine and lightweight.
Perfect. I just thought I've given you an opportunity to throw in more tissue paper references,
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ashley. You know me.
I know. All right, our next question here, this is from Mary, and she says that she altered her pattern based on her body measurements, but the finished product was much too large. How do I avoid such disparity in the future?
That can be caused by let's see. So if it ended up too big for your body,
I feel like we might need more information as to where, what area, right? Because that might.
Yeah, because if you altered it based on your body measurements, and then the pattern may have too much ease built into it to begin with. So all pattern companies are different in that respect, in how much wearing ease they put into their patterns and in the different areas. So if you you altered the pattern based on your measurements, the pattern may still have that wearing ease in there. So you can try, I don't know if, I don't think patterns tell you how much wearing ease they have in them anyway. So it may just be a matter of either pin fitting the garment, pin fitting the pattern on yourself, or making a mock-up in some other fabric before cutting into your project fabric, to see where that ease is and how that fits to your body. So pin fitting the pattern it cuts out a lot of time you might spend sewing a mock-up and gives you a general idea of the fit. It's not as exact as sewing a mock-up, but it'll give you a general idea of the sizing.
Do you pin fit with the actual like tissue papery pattern pieces, or do you trace them onto something else? How do you not rip them to pieces?
It's tough. I pin fit with the tissue paper just very carefully. If you have the time to transfer it onto like that, it's like just a lightweight, almost stabilizer kind of paper, but it's for patterns.
I call it exam room paper. It's like, it reminds me of like the paper in a doctor's office on big rolls
that they put on the beds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you have time to transfer the pattern tissue paper, if you have time to transfer the pattern off of the original tissue paper onto something else, that is ideal. But if you have to use just the tissue paper from the commercial, the pattern company, just be very careful. And it is tough because you've got to pin out the darts and everything. But yeah, it does need to be done very carefully. If you have a dress form that you can set to your measurements and pin fit it on the dress form, that's even better. And then make sure you're fitting the garment, or fitting the pattern on your body, wearing just your undergarments, so you don't have an extra layer of clothing underneath that pattern to interfere with your measurements.
Absolutely. All right, and next question here. What is the best thread for sewing garments, and what is the best ruler for pattern drafting?
The best thread for sewing garments, that all depends on what fabric you are making your garment with. So it's not a matter of matching your thread to like the garment, it's a matter of matching the thread to the fabric, and more specifically the fiber content of the thread to the fiber content of the fabric. You want them to be the same as often as you can, so that the thread wears the same and reacts the same to everything as the fabric does. Most often, reacting the same to washing is the most important. So when you're sewing a knit garment, no matter what the fiber content of the knit is, you want to use an all-purpose thread or a polyester thread because of the amount of give in the thread. But in other instances, you want to match the fiber contents. So if you're using a cotton, you're sewing a cotton quilt with your quilting cotton, your woven fabric, you want to use cotton thread. All-purpose thread also is okay in 99% of scenarios. But in special circumstances, like you're sewing a silk garment, we'll want to use a silk thread. If you are sewing, that's really kind of the most notable examples of matching your thread. But if you're doing top stitching on a garment, you'll want to use top stitching thread. Top stitching thread is a little bit thicker so it shows up more against your fabric. It gives your top stitching a little more pop. If you're sewing jeans, you're sewing denim, they do make a denim thread, which is a little bit thicker, so it's a little stronger going through all of those layers of denim. And of course, jeans, if you're sewing with denim, you're probably sewing jeans. That denim thread is thicker and stronger because jeans get a lot of wear and tear. So yeah, those are the bigger examples that I have to give.
And then the second part was the best ruler for pattern drafting.
Right, ruler for pattern drafting. I apologize also for my congestion. Everyone in my house has been sick, so I'm just getting over it. And the more I talk, the worse it gets. So
I'm just glad that we're just, not in the same room,
I know. So the best ruler for pattern drafting. I have got a French curve ruler from college, and it's kind of a long-ish ruler, but at the end, so it's got the one straight edge and the other edge, it kind of starts curving around and then it curves. It's got that real curved edge at the top. And you use that for any sort of curve that you've got on your pattern, your arm's eye, neckline, hip curves, hem curves. You move that French curve ruler around to find the grade of curve along that edge that you need. My long one, it's a long plastic one. It has been broken once already because it's so long, and I couldn't shove it into my backpack when I was in college. So I've seen some that are smaller and more compact, and they're kind of like curved around in different ways. So I've wanted one of those in theory, but I don't know that they have the more gentle curves that you use for hip curves and hem curves. So my long ruler, it has everything that I need. I've used it my entire life. Even after it has been broken, I taped it back together, and the curve, it works just fine. My only complaint was that I couldn't fit it into my backpack. I can't fit it into my purse when I'm taking my sewing stuff places. That's my only complaint about it. But otherwise, just a cheapy plastic, the long French curve ruler is all I have ever needed.
Perfect. I think we might have seen that French curve ruler a time or two on past months' sessions.
That's right. Everywhere.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here. I am over 60. Is it possible for me to begin to learn sewing and following patterns? I would like to, but I'm skeptical about investing in a machine and then not being able to use it because I don't know how to read or follow patterns.
Yes. So reading and following patterns can be kind of a daunting thing, but definitely don't let that deter you from starting sewing. So first of all, investing in a machine doesn't have to be like this huge overhead cost. Machines nowadays, prices are coming down, and I know there's a Brother machine that they make that's, the very lowest end is like $150 or $180 or something. Is very affordable, and it still has a lot of functionality. It's got your straight stitch, your zigzag, got a couple of buttonhole stitches and some built-in decorative stitches. So that's everything you need to get started. And as far as following a commercial pattern, if you start out small, start out with a skirt or even a tank top or something kind of small, not a lot of seaming details, not a lot of like buttonholes and zippers and moving parts like that. Start with like a straight skirt or an A-line skirt with a centered zipper in the back. It's not when you break it down. The commercial patterns have all the information you need on the back. They'll tell you how much fabric you need to buy for each size, and the notions that you need. And in the glossary, so in the pattern envelope, it comes with a guide sheet, an instruction sheet, and there's a glossary of what symbols mean. So when there's a notch, you cut out the notch, and notches are for matching. You know, the darts are marked with these markings. So they have the information there on the guide sheet. And I know this is a question that comes up a lot. So I know there are other places online that you can go to get information on how to read a guide sheet. There may even be videos on National Sewing Circle. Perhaps. I know in one of my longer form videos, I cover a little bit of that, of what pattern markings mean, and how patterns from different companies can look different, and things like that. So there are definitely other resources to go to if you don't understand something. You can always type it into your little search bar and find out what or what to do next. But just starting small with those commercial patterns, and building up your base knowledge of just familiarizing yourself with what a pattern looks like and what all those markings are, and then building from there, it will make it seem a lot less scary. But there's no way that you would buy a machine and invest in, the machine and the fabric and buying the pattern and not be able to figure it out. There are, you've got all the information there. All it takes is just time and patience.
Absolutely. And I have a follow-up question too, but just, because I need to plug National Sewing Circle a little bit more here too. We have so many videos on the site too that we're just showing you how to make something, and it doesn't even require necessarily a pattern, a commercial pattern, or even pattern pieces. It's just like understanding how to put something together. So that might be a place to start too, is videos, or if you're more of a visual learner versus reading a pattern or something like that, even though that is still visual, but you know what I mean. Watching somebody make it versus like reading a pattern. There's lots of those kind of things too. But in terms of commercial patterns, would you say as a beginner, there is some pattern or pattern companies that are easier to read and understand than others?
Yes.
Okay.
So between a lot of companies, there's not a lot of difference. Simplicity, McCall's, Butterick, I think they're all like under the same umbrella anyway. But then there's a lot of those like indie pattern companies, that very small companies that are coming out with patterns, and a lot of times those companies, they put more thought and effort and personalization into their patterns, so they can be more easily understandable sometimes. But the main outlier I found is Gerda style patterns can be challenging for beginners. They don't put, first of all, they
not
don't
enough pictures for me.
What's that?
There's not enough pictures. You know what I mean? Like
no. Yeah, there's no diagrams.
Mm-hmm.
They don't give. They give like 4 sentences of instructions for the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't put their seam allowances. They don't build seam allowances into the pattern. You have to add them yourself. At least for the pattern that I got from them. I don't know if that was a new thing or if it's just for the online patterns, because I got an online, just like a PDF pattern. And they were like, you need to add your own seam allowances. So that could be difficult for a beginner. And the lack of instruction, lack of pictures depicting what they want you to do. I know McCall's, they have helpful little diagrams for each step of the way. So yeah, if you're a beginner, build your base knowledge with other pattern companies, not Gerda style.
Absolutely.
They have a lot of really cute patterns and really, you know, great pattern styles, but for a beginner, it may be a little tough.
Absolutely. I think, you know, just when you go to say like Joann's and there's all those books you can flip through, I remember I bought a Vogue pattern and it was this really pretty dress. And I think I stared at that for years before I ever even like attempted to make it, just because it was the same thing. I like, you know, if there's a step and then there's a picture or something, you know, really easy to figure out. So definitely simplicity is one of my favorites, but all right. Our next question here, kind of a little bit of a trick question, but how do you sew a bias tape to a circle of vinyl fabric?
To a circle of vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
To make sure you use a needle that's a thinner needle. When you're sewing vinyl, once your needle goes through the fabric, that hole is there. It's not like a cotton fabric where fibers kind of forgive that hole. With vinyl, you punch a hole in the vinyl and that hole is there. So use a thinner needle so that hole is not damaging the fabric too much and it's not too visible. Whenever you're sewing with vinyl or faux leather or genuine leather, anything like that where you put a hole, the hole is there, use a longer stitch length. Shorter stitch length will basically just perforate the fabric and the whole thing is going to fall apart. So use a longer stitch length. Whenever possible, do not, same principle, just you don't want to put holes, you don't want to put too many holes in the fabric. So don't backstitch is what I'm getting at. Pull the thread to the wrong side and tie it off. No backstitching. So those are some basic vinyl stitching tips that would apply to that. So
I more meant like if it, since it is a circle, I usually like pin the heck out of it when I'm trying to, but it's vinyl, so do you really want to pin it? That was my
right. Yeah, you like freaked me out with that. Like, which part is was the trick? Sorry, this cold is messing with my brain too, as well as my throat. But no, you would not want to pin because you don't want to put holes in the vinyl. So use binder clips is a good way to hold things together when you're sewing something that you don't want to put holes in. So binder clips to clip that bias tape around the circle, and then to stitch using your thinner needle and your longer stitch length.
Perfect.
So that's a good point.
Awesome. All right, our next question here. Are threads sold in big box stores of a lesser quality than those sold in fabric or quilt stores?
No. So the threads that are sold, no matter where they're sold, they're coming from the same manufacturer anyway. And in terms of quality of thread between manufacturers, I don't know that I can really speak to that because you've got Gutermann, you've got Coates and Clark, and honestly, I just buy the thread that whatever color matches my fabric best, and if it's on sale. And I've never noticed a difference between thread manufacturers in terms of like quality of thread. There could be a difference if in one of the stores thread in direct sunlight. Don't buy that thread because, you know, threads stored in direct sunlight, the UV rays are eventually going to break down the fibers and damage the thread, and that will, you know, not be good for your sewing. So if there are any red flags at the store, like they have their thread in direct sunlight or somewhere where, you know, it's super damp and humid and there's mold growing, you know, that's also not good for thread. You want to keep your thread in a dry place away from direct sunlight. But other than that, I don't see much difference in thread, thread from, you know, different stores or even thread from different manufacturers, honestly.
I agree. I'm pretty sure for the first, like, I'm gonna say almost 20 years of sewing, I just bought always like Coats and Clark, and always, you know, at the checkout lane, there's like that basket of black and white, and I would just, you know, grab a bunch of those, and that's pretty much what I would use. But I never thought about that, of where stores store it, like, or display it. I guess I've never even noticed whether it was near a window or something. So now I'm gonna think about that next time I go to a store. I like it. Crafty. All right. All right. Next question here. I have been working with cotton that is wrinkly as part of the design of the fabric. How do I get the seams ironed without taking out the wrinkle of the material?
You can use just like the very tip of the iron right along the seam allowance to get that seam, you know, crisp and pressed open, and they shouldn't take out too much of the surrounding, you know, texture of the fabric if you just use, you know, the very tip there. You can also just, you know, try and finger press it a little bit. A lot of times if you give the fabric a shot of steam and then finger press, that'll help the finger pressing open that up and stay nice and crisp. If you happen to accidentally iron out some of that texture, ironing it back in by sort of folding over the fabric and re-wrinkling it up to match the rest of the fabric. That should, but using just the tip of the iron should work just fine to get right along that sewing line without ironing the rest of the fabric.
Absolutely. And just a fun tip that I just learned the other day about finger pressing to help it is if you like take your ironing board and get it really hot with your iron and then put your fabric on there and then finger press it. It works pretty good too. So
a lot of sense. I never thought of that.
Me neither. I literally just tried that out this morning. It was awesome. All right. Our next question here, this is from Chala, and she says, how do you sew faux fur on a collar?
Faux fur collars are very fun. Sewing faux fur on a collar. So you can sew faux fur, you know, right as part of the collar using the same methods as you would a regular collar, just with a couple of considerations for the faux fur. A longer pile faux fur is going to be more difficult to work with than a shorter pile faux fur, especially in a collar area because you have those very sharp points on the collar. If you want to make your collar have rounded points, that would make it easier, so you don't have to get right into the points. But to start, it's life easier to trim out the faux fur from the seam allowances of your collar, just to get that extra bulk out of the seam allowances. And when you are, after you stitch the faux fur onto your collar, brush and try to brush that fur, the seam, it's the seam, just kind of brush it out. Let's see, faux fur tips. Do you have any other faux fur tips?
Well, actually, I had a question about that. So I'm thinking, I guess I've never worn anything that has a faux fur collar, or even seen one. Is it generally faux fur on like both sides, or just the side when you fold it down?
Just the upper collar. So yeah, just the side when you have it folded down.
Okay.
Yeah, if you had it on both sides, that would be like real bulky.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I'm thinking. I mean, that's all I've ever seen and for sewing projects and, you know, ready to wear garments is that the fur is just the top portion of the collar.
So then since it's just on the top, faux fur doesn't normally like ravel, right? Because it's on like a kind of a backing. Would you be able to just like cut that out and almost just stitch it to the top rather than having to try and put it into a seam? Would that help eliminate some of the bulk or anything?
Yes, the backing. So yeah, the backing a lot of times is like a knit backing, so it's not going to fray and unravel on you. So that is definitely an option to just cut it out and sort of applique it onto the top of the collar. Just make sure that I guess the edges, the cut edges, are hidden, either like folded under a little bit, just so that that cut edge you can't really, so that you won't be able to see it on the edge.
On the edge, where
under
up here, I feel like where the fur like brushes down over it, it would cover it pretty good. Maybe.
Yeah, if the pile was long enough.
Yeah. But we do have videos on National Sewing Circle for working with difficult fabric, which does include a section on how to work with faux fur. And I believe, do you have one that has anything with difficult fabric as well? Or is it leather, faux leather?
Yeah, mine was leather. I didn't do anything with fur.
I did do, I have a class on there, and a whole section is faux fur and faux leather. And I show fun ways on how to actually join your seams and make it pretty much invisible, like when you're done sewing. So tons of faux fur tips there. Never put it on a collar though. I might have to try it out. All right, we have time for one more here. What is the best technique to embroider on a sports jersey? You know, that synthetic material with all the little holes in it.
I do know that material. So embroidering on a sports jersey, that's actually kind of a thinner material too. So the main tip when embroidering is to match your stabilizer type to the fabric type. Or cutaway stabilizers, thicker; tearaway stabilizer, a little thinner; water-soluble stabilizer, thinner yet; and then heat-removable stabilizers, very, very thin, kind of a film. So for a sports jersey, you'd probably use either a tearaway or a water-soluble. Tearaway is always my go-to. It's very versatile and it works great. That's, you know, number one. Match your stabilizer weight to your fabric weight if you can. But otherwise, that sport jersey material might not need any special considerations other than, you know, anything different than embroidering on a cotton fabric or anything. It seems pretty straightforward. Just make sure that you don't stretch the fabric when you are hooping it.
And would the holes play a part at all? Are they big enough to affect the design at all?
They shouldn't be. I haven't looked that close at a sports jersey in a long time. But from my memory, the holes shouldn't be, you know, too big, or wouldn't be big enough to affect the design at all. If by chance they were, and you stitched it out and you looked at it and you're like, man, if I wash away the stabilizer, the threads are going to come loose in these holes, you can leave the stabilizer under the threads. It'll leave the stabilizer on the back of the shirt. So when you're wearing it, you may be able to feel it against your skin, but it's better than the threads becoming all like loose and gloppy in those holes. You know, you can solve that problem. It's by, you know, leaving the stabilizer on. It wouldn't create, you know, too much of an inconvenience to have that against your skin,
right?
And it would make your design look nicer. So if those holes became a problem, you could do that.
I would say. And I would say if the holes are just that big, probably just don't embroider on that fabric.
Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering all of our sewing questions and even a couple quilting questions tonight. You really branched out there.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we hope to see you again next month to answer even more of your sewing questions. Again, we thank everybody for watching. And if you submitted questions tonight, hopefully you got them answered. If not, you can always email questions into us and we will answer them at any time. So thank you guys so much for watching.